Have you ever stopped to wonder why entire nations follow monsters into madness? Why millions obey the command to kill, to silence, to conform, not with chains, but with belief? It's not the whip. It's not the gun. It's the story. The tyrant doesn't need to control your body. He only needs to infect your perception and let your mind do the rest. Because when a man believes he's free, he'll chain himself and call it loyalty. Every era has its tyrants, but they rarely enter with blood. They arrive with ideas. The tyrant does not begin by banning your thoughts. He begins by redefining them. He gives you a new enemy, a new virtue, a new language, until reality itself begins to feel negotiable. Words become weapons. Silence becomes guilt. And obedience becomes survival. But here's the truth no one wants to admit. Tyranny is a relationship. It needs participation, not from monsters, but from ordinary people, teachers, workers, neighbors, who learn to silence their questions, smile at the flag, and march in step because everyone else does. This is the psychology of mass control. It doesn't start in the streets. It starts in the mind. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that still haunts the modern conscience. He placed ordinary people in a room, gave them a lab coat, and asked them to press a button. Every press delivered what they were told was an electric shock to a man in another room. The man screamed, begged, went silent, but 65% of participants continued administering shocks until the final switch, labeled XXX, danger, severe shock. Why? Because an authority figure told them it was okay. Because they were not responsible. Because someone else said, this is normal. This is not about cruelty. It's about context. Psychological experiments like Milgram's and later the Stanford Prison Experiment show us one chilling truth. The line between citizen and tyrant's tool is thinner than we think. And when the context is engineered, when fear is weaponized, when language is manipulated, when identity is tribalized, humans can justify anything, even genocide. So how does a tyrant engineer this context? Not by force, but by narrative. He tells you a story. There is a threat. There is a savior. There is an enemy among us. And then he hands you a mask, calls it patriotism, calls it virtue, calls it truth. Suddenly, anyone who questions the story becomes the threat. And loyalty becomes a performance, not a principle. The tyrant doesn't crush you. He lets you crush each other in his name. This is the secret. Control the narrative, and you control the neurology. The mind is pliable. When under threat, the brain shuts down critical thinking and activates primitive loyalty circuits. Fight, flight, obey, submit. The tyrant knows this. He doesn't need to win the argument. He just needs to overwhelm your attention with fear, repetition, and noise. And before you know it, you'll defend your own cage. It's not just in history books. It's happening now. On screens, in headlines, in subtle shifts in language, in the rising intolerance for complexity, in the obsession with sides. Right, wrong, us, hero, enemy. But life is not binary, and any system that demands you shut down your doubt is already a form of psychological colonization. The question is not, would I have obeyed Hitler? The real question is, what narrative are you obeying right now without even realizing it? Because tyranny no longer needs tanks. It needs likes, shares, clicks, and a population too exhausted to think. You are not being ruled by iron fists. You are being ruled by ideas, soft, sticky, seductive ideas that melt into your identity and make you forget that you were ever free. Because in the end, it's not the tyrant who controls you. It's the version of truth you never dared to question. And that is the most powerful prison of all. The crowd doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just nods. It nods quietly, submissively, beneath fluorescent lights and patriotic slogans. Obedience, not as a virtue, but as a mechanism. The silent architecture built into the mind. We imagine tyrants as screaming men on podiums. But they often begin as reflections of what the masses want to believe. Order, safety, purpose. And once these needs are touched, once that psychological cord is plucked, obedience becomes sacred. It is in that obedience that the most chilling crimes of history are committed. Not by monsters, but by ordinary people. This is the true genius of tyranny. It doesn't force you. It convinces you that you want it. A sterile room, 1961. Yale University. Dr. Stanley Milgram begins his infamous experiment. Volunteers, everyday people, are asked to administer electric shocks to a stranger in another room whenever they answer a question incorrectly. The voltage increases. 150 volts. 300, 450. The screams grow louder. The person behind the switch hesitates. But a man in a white lab coat says calmly, "The experiment requires that you continue." And most do. Milgram wasn't studying cruelty. He was studying obedience. And what he found was haunting. 65% of participants went all the way, delivering what they believed were fatal shocks, just because an authority figure told them to. Let that settle. These weren't sadists. They were people like you, like me, following rules, keeping order, trusting the system. And the moment you realize this, something cold creeps in, because you begin to wonder, would you have done the same? Obedience is comfortable. Swarm. It says, don't think, don't question, just follow. Tyrants know this. They don't need to force loyalty. They just need to reward submission. So long as you follow the protocol, so long as you salute at the right time, repeat the right slogans, and stay within your lane, you're safe. You're praised. You're part of the story. But step outside it, and you become dangerous. Not because of what you've done, but because you thought. Groupthink begins here. When individuals abandon personal responsibility and adopt the morality of the collective. It doesn't start with mass rallies. It starts with small silences, with people saying, "It's not my place," or "I'm sure someone else will speak up." This is how history folds. Quietly, behind closed doors, in meetings, in classrooms, in families. Now imagine this power in the hands of a master manipulator, someone who knows how to stir fear and promise relief. That's how Hitler rose. He didn't begin with gas chambers. He began with language, with carefully crafted phrases that made people feel seen, blamed the right outsiders, gave the right illusions of control. And the people, intelligent people, educated people, followed. Because the narrative was simple, and it gave them someone to obey. The human mind craves structure, especially in chaos. And tyrants don't create fear. They harvest it. They offer obedience as the cure. But what they're really selling is control. The same psychology that made the Milgram subjects press the button is what made citizens hand over their neighbors, salute at atrocities, and write policies that destroyed millions. They didn't feel like villains. They felt like patriots, like good citizens, like decent workers doing their job. This is the hidden terror of obedience. It makes you feel righteous while you participate in madness. Because obedience wears the mask of decency. It speaks in calm voices. It files paperwork. It nods in meetings. It doesn't scream. That's why it's so dangerous. Now look around you. Modern life hasn't escaped this. It's just evolved. You follow rules you never question. Tap agree on terms you never read. Repeat phrases you didn't invent. Take sides in conflicts you never fully understood. Why? Because someone told you it was right. Because someone said, this is what smart people believe. Because questioning is inconvenient. And in that convenience, you obey. Not violently. Not hatefully, but quietly, and the systems thank you for it. The Milgram experiment never ended. It just changed costume. From lab coats to influencers. From shock buttons to screen swipes. From authoritarian regimes to algorithmic manipulation. And the same mind, your mind, is still vulnerable to the same levers. Fear. Belonging. Obedience. The tyrants of today don't yell at you. They nudge you. And that might be even more dangerous. We like to think that tyranny is something external. A brute force. A monster that storms the gates of reason. But the truth is more intimate. Tyranny whispers before it roars. It doesn't need to shout when obedience is already hardwired into the spine of society. In 1961, a man named Stanley Milgram set up an experiment at Yale University. He wanted to answer a haunting question. How far will ordinary people go when told to do something by an authority figure? A volunteer was instructed to administer electric shocks to another person, a stranger, each time they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks increased in intensity. 15 volts, 45 volts, 120 volts. Screams began, then silence. And still, they obeyed. 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum shock of 450 volts. Even as they believed the person they were shocking was unconscious or dead. They were not sadists. They were not monsters. They were just obedient. Tyranny doesn't begin with violence. It begins with the quiet redefinition of morality. It asks, are you a good person? Then answers, if you follow the rules, yes. And slowly, obedience becomes virtue. Conformity becomes morality, and disobedience? A sin. In every tyrannical regime, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, you'll find a similar pattern. The creation of an ultimate authority, and beneath it, a hierarchy of obedience. Each level shields the individual from moral responsibility. I was just following orders. The most dangerous sentence ever spoken, because it allows cruelty to be outsourced. Responsibility evaporates under the uniform of command, and evil becomes administrative. Milgram's experiment revealed something disturbing. The architecture of obedience is not built by tyrants. It is offered by the people themselves. Why? Because obedience feels safe. Because chaos is frightening. Because thinking is exhausting. And because, deep down, many of us are terrified of standing alone. A uniform gives you protection. A slogan gives you direction. A command gives you purpose. And before long, the mind is no longer yours. But here's the deeper truth. The tyrant does not need to command you directly. They only need to shape the environment, place you in a lab coat, give you a clipboard, put a man in a gray suit behind a desk, and you'll shock a stranger to death. This is not just about politics or history. It's about psychology. Because if tyranny resides anywhere, it is in the part of us that wants to obey. The child within who still looks for permission. The worker who fears stepping out of line. The citizen who confuses legality with morality. Look around today, and you'll see echoes of Milgram everywhere. Not electric shocks, but social ones. Speak the wrong opinion, and you're exiled. Disobey the narrative, and you're punished. Follow orders, repeat slogans, stay safe. Modern tyranny doesn't wear a military uniform. It wears a suit. It smiles. It tells you you're doing the right thing. And then asks you to look away. The tyrant doesn't just want control over your actions. They want control over your sense of rightness. Obedience, under this lens, becomes a moral addiction. You want to feel like you belong. You want to feel like you're good. And so you obey, again and again and again. Even when the voice in your gut says no. Even when the scream on the other side of the wall grows silent. What Milgram proved is chillingly simple. The line between good and evil does not run between nations or ideologies. It runs through each person, and how willing we are to give up thinking to someone else. So when tyrants rise, when orders are given, when the crowd chants and the slogans flood the sky, ask yourself, is it obedience or surrender? Is it virtue or fear? Is it loyalty or silence disguised as safety? Because history does not remember those who obeyed. Only those who chose not to. They didn't scream because they didn't feel pain. They didn't rebel because they didn't know they were imprisoned. That is the most terrifying thing about obedience. It doesn't come with chains. It comes with comfort, with routine, with purpose. And that is how tyrants succeed, not by fear, but by slowly turning the masses into believers. Not believers in truth, but in authority. In 1961, Stanley Milgram's infamous obedience experiment shocked the world. Participants, ordinary people, were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger for incorrect answers. They heard the screams. They saw the agony. But 65% of them continued, simply because a man in a lab coat said, "Please continue." Milgram's experiment wasn't just about obedience. It revealed something darker. How the human mind will betray its own morality when cloaked in the illusion of duty. The participants weren't evil. They were responsible citizens, teachers, clerks, fathers, and yet they obeyed. Why? Because the burden of responsibility is heavy, and we are wired to give it away. To an expert, to a leader, to someone, anyone, who promises certainty in a chaotic world. And in that trade we lose ourselves. We exchange conscience for comfort. individuality for ideology. And a man stops being a man. He becomes a cog. Crowds have no memory, no guilt, no soul. And this is what tyrants understand better than anyone. They don't address the person. They address the mob, the wounded animal that seeks identity in others, the frightened voice that craves simplicity, the broken self that begs to belong. And when you give the crowd a unifying symbol, a flag, a uniform, an anthem, you create the myth that's more powerful than any logic. You create mass delusion. Suddenly, obedience becomes virtue, worship becomes loyalty, and questioning becomes betrayal. What begins as patriotism turns into fanaticism. What begins as love for one's nation becomes hatred for those outside it. History has seen it over and over. From the Third Reich, to Stalin's purges, to modern-day authoritarian cults. And the scariest part? It always begins with a whisper. In the Milgram study, participants looked to the man in the lab coat for moral guidance. He was calm, confident, official, and in that moment, he represented the state. To resist him wasn't just to resist an order, it was to risk exile from the system that gave them identity. This is how obedience becomes self-preservation. To disobey is to stand alone. And nothing terrifies the human mind more than isolation. We are tribal creatures. Our brains evolved not for truth, but for acceptance. That's why even when people know deep down that something is wrong, they still conform. Because the social cost of rebellion is often greater than the moral cost of obedience. And tyrants, they prey on this. They isolate dissenters. They make examples of them. And slowly, questioning becomes dangerous. Not because of punishment, but because of loneliness. In recent years, a controversial but deeply relevant term has emerged: mass formation psychosis. The idea that when individuals are isolated, anxious, and uncertain, they become highly susceptible to collective belief systems, even if irrational. Sound familiar? It should. It's the foundation of every totalitarian regime. Step 1. Disorient the people with chaos. Step 2. Provide them with a single voice of clarity, the tyrant. Step 3. Eliminate dissent, not with violence first, but with social exile. Step 4. Create the reality where truth is not what is real, but what is repeated. This isn't just politics. It's psychology weaponized. And it works not because people are weak, but because they are human. Eventually, obedience turns to reverence. The tyrant becomes more than a man. He becomes a myth. He is seen as invincible, eternal, righteous. His speeches become scripture. His image, sacred. His words, beyond questioning. Just as cult leaders like Jim Jones and Charles Manson seduced the minds of their followers through repetition, ritual, and psychological dependency, tyrants elevate themselves above the law, above logic, above humanity. And once a population begins to worship its leader, it no longer sees his flaws. It sees only threats to his divinity. This is why, in the final stages of tyranny, the people themselves begin to defend their own oppression. They fight not for freedom, but for the one who took it. The war on truth begins with the war on the individual mind. And that war is won when obedience becomes a virtue, not by force but by love. Love for the leader, love for the myth, love for the illusion. And that is the most terrifying form of control, when the prisoner no longer wants to escape. When the door is open and he chooses to stay inside. The tyrant does not merely rely on soldiers or symbols. He relies on emotions, deep, raw, primal emotions. And none more powerful than fear. Fear is not just a fleeting reaction. It is architecture. It is a blueprint. It is a tool for crafting a psychological prison with invisible bars, bars the people themselves reinforce. A frightened population is an obedient one, not because they are weak, but because they are human. And tyrants know this. They study it, cultivate it, and unleash it with surgical precision. But fear alone is not enough. It must be manufactured and maintained in doses like morphine. Too little and people grow bold. Too much and they rebel. The dosage must be perfect. Just enough to paralyze, but not enough to provoke. This is the alchemy of authoritarianism. Let us step inside this laboratory of fear. In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that shocked the world, literally. Volunteers were told to deliver electric shocks to a stranger in another room whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The stranger wasn't real, it was an actor, but the participant didn't know that. What mattered was the setup. Behind the participant stood a man in a white lab coat. Calm, composed, authoritative. He simply said, "Please continue." And they did. Over and over again, they pressed the button. They heard the actor scream, beg, go silent. Yet 65% of them went all the way to the maximum voltage, 450 volts. Why? Not because they were sadists, not because they were cruel, but because an authority figure told them it was necessary. Milgram had uncovered something terrifying. Obedience can override empathy. Fear of authority, of consequence, of being seen as disobedient, these are enough to make an average person inflict unspeakable pain. This is what tyrants understand intuitively. They do not need to force the masses to comply. They simply need to position themselves as the source of order. And once people believe that resisting you means falling into chaos, they will comply out of their own need for psychological safety. What's most insidious is that the instruments of fear often wear the costume of reason. Tyrants do not announce themselves as monsters. They arrive as guardians, protectors. We must do this for your safety. They invoke invisible enemies, traitors, infiltrators, moral decay. They are coming to destroy your way of life, your family, your future. And only I can protect you. So the public consents. First to surveillance, then to censorship, then to detention, then to worse. And each time, the line moves further back. The boiling water rises another degree. The frog never jumps. In North Korea, entire families are sent to labor camps if one member commits a political crime. Not because the regime lacks space for criminals, but because fear is most effective when it is collectivized. When your actions can harm not just you, but your children, your spouse, your parents. Suddenly, every word becomes a weapon, every silence a risk, and so, the people become the enforcers of their own oppression. They watch themselves. They report on neighbors. They censor their thoughts before they ever reach their lips. This is not control by brute force. This is internalized tyranny. This too is part of the design. Tyrants do not only build prisons out of fear. They build them out of hope, false hope. They promise that if you just comply long enough, Stay silent long enough, obey hard enough, you will be safe. You will be rewarded. So people cling to the illusion, to the fantasy, to the lie. And in doing so, they become participants in their own subjugation. Not because they are fools, but because the alternative, facing the truth, requires a kind of courage most are never taught to cultivate. There is an almost religious quality to mass obedience. Obedience becomes virtue, doubt becomes heresy, and tyrants become gods. This is why every tyrant surrounds himself with iconography, statues, parades, chants, slogans. It is not about ego. It is about creating an emotional trance, a state in which questioning authority feels like blasphemy. And once the psychological bond is forged, it no longer matters how absurd the rules become. Once you've accepted that safety and truth come only from the leader, reality itself becomes negotiable. The group will accept anything, even if it's madness. What tyrants fear most is not rebellion. It is awareness. It is the moment someone sees the invisible bars. It is the moment a voice pierces the silence and asks, why? Because fear loses its power the moment you confront it. Not with violence, but with clarity, with awareness, with the refusal to obey what your conscience knows is wrong. In every dark regime, there are those who whisper, who question, who resist quietly. They are not always heroes. Most are afraid. Most suffer. But they are the beginning of something the tyrant cannot control. Awakening. What if the greatest trick tyranny ever pulled wasn't oppression, but illusion? In modern societies, tyranny no longer marches in boots or screams from podiums. It wears a mask of democracy, of liberty, of choice. And the masses, drugged by convenience and noise, believe themselves to be free. But if freedom means thinking what you are told to think, if it means choosing between options curated by others, if it means consuming pre-approved truths until obedience becomes second nature, then what is this freedom? It is not freedom. It is the cage with golden bars. It is slavery by seduction. The modern tyrant doesn't need to burn books. He simply floods you with distractions. He doesn't imprison your body. He convinces your mind to stay inside the cell voluntarily. This is the genius of psychological control in the 21st century. Not by suppression, but by simulation. You are made to feel free because you can scroll, swipe, share. But the narratives you scroll through are curated. The swipes you make are engineered. The posts you see are designed to keep you addicted, polarized, compliant. And when you begin to question, the algorithm rewards you with outrage. Until questioning becomes exhaustion. Until surrender feels like peace. It's no longer about erasing your ability to think. It's about making thinking so difficult, so noisy, so overwhelming, that you beg for silence. And into that silence, they insert the narrative. Tyrants have evolved. They don't only rule with fear. They rule with convenience. They feed you so many choices, you forget which ones matter. They seduce you with comfort until you willingly abandon the weight of responsibility. And once you do, obedience feels like relief. Stanley Milgram's shock experiment wasn't just a relic of the 1960s. It was a mirror, a warning, an echo of what we still carry within us. Participants weren't monsters. They were ordinary people. Just like you. Just like me. But under pressure, under guidance, under structure. They obeyed, even when it meant harming another human being, even when their conscience screamed, even when their hands shook. Why? Because the responsibility had been outsourced, the moral weight passed on. I was just following orders. And that is the most terrifying phrase in any language. Modern tyrants do not need to command anymore. They simply provide systems that guide. They build structures so convincing, so seamless, that questioning them feels dangerous. They hide behind institutions, behind laws, behind culture. They make you police yourself. They make you shame the dissenters. And if someone speaks out, they are not silenced with bullets. They are drowned in ridicule, censorship, or indifference. It's not brute force. It's psychological architecture. And we live inside it. You may believe this doesn't apply to you, that you are awake, that you are aware. But the system isn't designed to confront you. It's designed to absorb you, to make you feel you're in control while you are slowly becoming a cog, a consumer, a participant in your own psychological conditioning. And the most terrifying part? The system no longer needs a tyrant, because once the structure is built, once obedience becomes automated, once fear is replaced by routine, the machine runs itself. He who controls the narrative controls the mind. These words weren't just a warning. They were a prophecy. In a world where truth is fragmented, where thought is commodified, where freedom is packaged in dopamine hits, who controls the story you live in? Is it you? Or is it the echo of a voice you never questioned? You were never taught to resist. You were taught to adapt, to fit in, to survive. But the mind is not a tool of obedience. It is a weapon. It is a mirror. It is your last line of defense. Use it before it's used against you.